He spent almost 30 years in the United States Senate, was one of Donald Trump's harshest critics before becoming one of his closest allies, and built a friendship with Joe Biden that survived 4 decades of political combat. Then, in July 2026, Lindsey Graham was gone, and the tributes that followed, from world leaders to political rivals, revealed just how singular his career actually was. This is a real story of Lindsey Graham, told through what actually happened. The votes, the wars, the friendships, and the transformation that defined modern Republican politics. Lindsey Graham was born in 1955 in Central South Carolina, where his parents ran a small restaurant, pool hall, and liquor store. Both of his parents died within about 15 months of each other, while Graham was still in college, and he ended up helping raise and later legally adopting his younger sister, Darlene, who was only 13 at the time. That early experience of responsibility shaped a lot of how Graham talked about himself publicly for the rest of his life. He went on to study at the University of South Carolina, earned his law degree there in 1981, and then spent years in military service, first on active duty with the Air Force, then in the South Carolina Air National Guard, and later the Air Force Reserve, where he served as a JAG officer and eventually retired as a colonel in 2015. That military background became a constant thread in his political identity, reinforcing his image as a hawk on defense and foreign policy long before most Americans knew his name. Graham entered Congress in 1995, representing South Carolina's 3rd congressional district in the House of Representatives, and he became a nationally recognizable figure during the impeachment proceedings against President Bill Clinton, where he served as one of the House managers arguing the case in the Senate trial. That experience put him on the radar of national Republican leadership, and in 2002 he won election to the U.S. Senate seat, being vacated by longtime Senator Strom Thurmond, taking office in January 2003. From that point on, Graham became one of the most consistent and recognizable Republican voices in Washington, serving on the Senate Judiciary Committee and eventually rising to chair both the Judiciary Committee and, at different points, the Senate Budget Committee. Judicial nominations became one of the defining parts of Graham's legislative record. As a senior member and later chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he played a central role in shepherding Supreme Court confirmations through the Senate, including the nominations of Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett during Trump's first term. Graham was often the public face defending those nominees during contentious hearings, particularly during the Kavanaugh confirmation, where his forceful floor speech defending the nominee against sexual misconduct allegations became one of the most replayed moments of his career and cemented his reputation among conservative voters as a fighter willing to go to the mat for the party's judicial priorities. He continued to play a leading role in judicial confirmations throughout his time in the Senate, arguing consistently that presidents, regardless of party, deserve broad deference in their picks for the federal bench, a position that put him at odds with some Democrats, but was broadly popular within his own party. Foreign policy was arguably the area where Graham had his deepest and most consistent impact. He built his reputation as one of the Senate's most vocal foreign policy hawks, closely aligned for years with the late Senator John McCain of Arizona. The two men traveled internationally together constantly, pushing for a muscular American role abroad, whether that meant supporting military intervention, defending NATO alliances, or pressing successive presidents to take a harder line against adversaries like Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Graham was one of the most outspoken advocates in Congress for continued U.S. military and financial support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion, and in the final month of his life, he traveled to Kyiv to meet with Ukrainian officials, part of a pattern of overseas trips that defined his approach to the job. He was also a long-time vocal supporter of Israel and a fierce critic of Iran's government, regularly calling for tougher sanctions and expressing support for regime change in Tehran. When Iran's supreme leader was killed in 2026, Graham was among the senators who spoke publicly about what it meant for the region and for American policy going forward. His foreign policy instincts didn't always fit neatly into either party's mainstream. He worked with Democratic administrations when he agreed with their approach abroad and criticized Republican presidents when he thought they were pulling back too far from America's global commitments, which is part why his death prompted tributes not just from American political figures, but from foreign leaders as well, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who spoke about the personal relationship the two had built over years of meetings. Graham's relationship with Donald Trump is probably the single most talked about transformation of his political career, and it's worth laying out plainly. because it happened in full public view. During the 2016 Republican presidential primary, Graham ran against Trump for the nomination and was one of his most outspoken critics within the party. He questioned Trump's temperament, criticized his rhetoric, and warned publicly that Trump's approach could damage the Republican Party's standing and the country's standing in the world. Those criticisms were sharp and specific, and they were widely covered at the time as some of the most direct attacks coming from a fellow Republican. But after Trump won the presidency, the relationship between the two men shifted gradually and then dramatically. Graham has said publicly on multiple occasions that the change came through direct contact, golf outings, phone calls, and meetings where he said he came to understand Trump's decision-making in a way he hadn't from the outside. By the time Trump's first term was underway, Graham had become one of his most reliable defenders in the Senate, especially on judicial appointments and matters of national security. That alliance only deepened over the following years. Trump endorsed Graham's re-election campaigns, calling him a steadfast supporter, and Graham in turn became one of the administration's most visible allies on cable news and in the Senate chamber. When Graham died in July 2026, Trump was among the first to react publicly, describing him on social media as one of the greatest people and senators he had ever known, and saying the two had spoken by phone just hours before Graham's death, with Trump later telling NBC News that Graham had seemed fine, except for being tired. What makes Graham's career harder to fit into a simple story is that his willingness to build relationships across party lines wasn't limited to Trump. Long before he became a Trump ally, Graham had one of the most well-documented friendships in the modern Senate with Joe Biden, dating back to when the two served together on the Judiciary Committee and later the Foreign Relations Committee. They disagreed on almost every major policy question of the era: taxes, immigration, health care, judicial nominees, and they said so publicly and often, sometimes sharply. But they also traveled internationally together on committee business, worked on bipartisan legislation, and by most public accounts maintained real personal warmth even during periods of intense political conflict. That kind of relationship between a conservative Republican and the man who would become a Democratic president became increasingly rare in Washington as the parties polarized, and commentators regularly pointed to Graham and Biden as one of the last visible examples of an older Senate culture where political rivals could also be genuine friends. His friendship with John McCain followed a similar pattern in a different direction, since the two were ideological allies for most of their careers rather than opponents. When McCain died in 2018 after a battle with brain cancer, Graham gave one of the more emotional public tributes of his career, telling reporters he had cried over the loss of a man he called one of his dearest friends and mentors, and later revealing in a tearful interview that McCain's final words to him were about love and having no regrets. Graham's voting record over nearly 3 decades placed him consistently within the conservative wing of the Republican Party, particularly on social and cultural issues, where he opposed same-sex marriage for most of his career and generally supported judicial nominees who shared that conservative judicial philosophy. He also built a record on immigration and border security that frequently put him at odds with parts of his own party, at times pushing for comprehensive reform efforts alongside Democrats, and at other times taking a harder line depending on the political moment and who was in the White House. That kind of shifting positioning drew criticism from some corners as political calculation, while supporters argued it reflected genuine pragmatism from a legislator who cared more about getting outcomes than ideological purity. In February 2026, Graham filed for what would have been his 5th term in the Senate, with Trump's endorsement behind him, and by June he had won the Republican primary in South Carolina and was widely expected to cruise to re-election in November. That expectation ended on the night of July 11, 2026, when Graham died suddenly at the age of 71, just hours after returning home from a trip to Ukraine, where he had been meeting with officials about continued American support for the country's defense against Russia. His office initially described it as a brief and sudden illness. Days later, according to a statement from his communications director citing preliminary findings from a medical examiner's office in Washington, the cause of death was identified as an aortic dissection resulting from arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, with toxicology and further testing still pending to finalize the death certificate. The response to Graham's death crossed party lines in a way that reflected the complicated, often contradictory relationships he built over his career. Tributes came in from Trump, from Democratic colleagues he had sparred with for years, and from foreign leaders including Netanyahu, who spoke about the personal bond the two had developed. Under South Carolina law, Governor Henry McMaster had the authority to appoint an interim replacement to serve out the remainder of Graham's term, and he chose Graham's sister, Darlene Graham Nordun, the same Sister Graham had helped raise and later adopted after their parents' deaths decades earlier. She was sworn in during a ceremony at the Capitol in mid-July, and after facing pressure from Trump and others to run for the seat in her own right, she announced she would seek the full term in the November election. Her decision set off a scramble among South Carolina Republicans and Democrats alike, with multiple candidates from both parties entering the race to fill a Senate seat that had effectively been held by only two people, Graham and his predecessor Strom Thurmond, for the better part of 80 years. Looking back at the full arc of his career, what stands out about Lindsey Graham isn't any single vote or position, but the pattern of a legislator who moved between roles that most people assume are incompatible. Fierce partisan and personal friend to political opponents, outspoken Trump critic, and later one of his most trusted allies. A defense hawk willing to break with his own party's isolationist wing when he thought American commitments abroad were at stake. Whether that pattern reflected principled pragmatism or shifting political calculation was something people disagreed about his entire career, and that disagreement didn't disappear when he died. What is documented, though, is a legislative record spanning nearly 3 decades, a foreign policy legacy built on relationships from Kiev to Jerusalem, and personal friendships that cross party lines in the Senate that increasingly doesn't produce them anymore. That's the record Lindsey Graham left behind, built through votes, speeches, hearings, and international trips that are all part of the public record, not through speculation about who he was behind closed doors.